Welcome to Daily Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, we are here with Luke Rodriguez, a lawyer and public defender in Los Angeles. Luke, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I feel very lucky to be among many of the great guests that you've had.
There we go. So you are one of my go-to calls whenever something happens politically. I always like to tell people you're probably the person who single-handedly knows more about politics and politicians than anyone else I know. So naturally, you were one of my first calls when this news came of the Trump deportation of the Columbia student. I'm torn on this. You're not torn on this. Before we discuss the ins and outs, and I could unpack, why I'm torn, can you just delineate the case and exactly what happened for people that are not familiar?
Yeah, so essentially there was a Columbia University student who is a legal permanent resident, also known as a green card holder. And the Trump administration, well, President Trump specifically, within the first few days in office, issued an executive order that essentially students who were Hamas sympathizers, as he phrases it, would be stripped of their visas, subject to deportation. So this student was involved in the Columbia, I would say that were the disgraceful Columbia University protests. And it sounds like he was a leader of some sorts of it, espoused some views that were rather distasteful and offensive. And so it seems like he was sort of the number one target by the administration. He was apprehended by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He is currently being detained at a detention facility in Louisiana and is now being subject to a rescission of his green card or legal permanent residency status and deported. I think he's from Syria. So that's sort of the posture of where we are now.
So I saw just on social media you posting about, how this is terrible, no conversation about it. I think there's sort of two different things that pop into my head. I've been reading just so much about this today because all over, I would say, Jewish social media, I would say half the people were lauding this and half the people were saying, this is not the right direction. And I think in my head, like I'm, directly split down the middle with those two opinions. We'll talk with some of the legal takes that I heard first, that we could talk philosophy. You're a lot more equipped to handle the legalities than I am. But I've been seeing, one of the things that's been quoted is the, Title 8 in the United States Code, Section 1227, just to make sure that I got that right, that talks about somebody on a green card, if they are supporting terrorist activity, that is something that can actually get them deported. So I guess just from a strictly legal perspective, without even getting into any, normative opinions, if you were a public defender, I mean, how would you defend this person? It seems pretty obvious, if you could connect SJP to supporting Hamas, which, it seems like, obviously not every SJP member supports Hamas, but in general, the organization is very sympathetic to Hamas. I would guess this was one of the leaders of the Columbia, SJP movement. I have no doubt that they were lauding Hamas and many of the other, armed terrorist groups against Israel. Why is this not a deportable offense?
Sure. So a few things I want to delineate. First, I'm not an expert in immigration law. I know a decent amount about First Amendment law, but again, I'm not an expert. My expertise is criminal defense. And I also add to that I do not speak for my office at all. I'm speaking as an individual, but I certainly can draw on my experiences at my work to help answer some of these questions. So first, it's my understanding, and a listener down the road may be able to.
Only a lawyer would have to make that.
County employee, man. I got to be careful. I may be wrong on this, and again, I didn't have a ton of time to research all these issues before I hopped on. But my understanding is, so that is true, that is what the federal statute says, but it hasn't been adjudicated as to its constitutionality. So it may be the case, just like there's a lot of federal laws that exist on the books, but there maybe hasn't really been a true test of it, or at least the broadness of it, as there is now. So if you had a much more clear case where somebody was providing material aid to Hamas, that would probably withstand constitutional review. That would probably be constitutional to deport them. But if you have a situation where someone is simply advocating for the same political goals of Hamas, there is a real concern that this statute, the way that it exists, encompasses a lot of protected speech. And there's a First Amendment doctrine called overbreadth. And the idea is that when a statute encompasses a lot of protected speech, that the statute itself is unconstitutional. But even if that's not true of this statute, we have something else called an as-applied challenge. So it may be the case that generally it is legal to rescind the green card of somebody who is, a supporter of a terrorist organization, whatever that may mean. But there may be specific as-applied instances where that violates the First Amendment. So just because his conduct may fall within the statute doesn't mean that it's therefore legal for the federal government to rescind him of his green card status and deport him. It is still subject to judicial review as to whether or not his First Amendment rights were violated.
Got it. So the problem here, at least on first glance, isn't that he's potentially going to be deported after a court hearing. It's that they initially came to his, house without a warrant. What or what exactly? Like pinpoint to me the problem.
No, the issue is that even if it were true that this statute is generally constitutional, and I don't know, and even if it's true that his conduct fits within the statute, it may still be the case that as applied to him, the statute is being applied unconstitutionally, that it's too vague, it's too overbroad, and that his speech is still protected speech. Even if it fits within the definition of the statute, this might be an unconstitutional application of the statute.
I see. Okay. So that's sort of the legalese, that's at least from my perspective, I mean, super interesting, but I think, the less philosophically interesting, thinking about this philosophically, this is still a little bit half-baked. I was just going to call you to chat on this on my drive home, but as I told you, I was like, let's just record this because I think it'll be an interesting conversation nonetheless. I think I'm almost envisioning, if we can imagine this metaphor, we're sort of on top of a mountaintop and there's slippery slopes on both sides. I mean, I think oftentimes
Right.
the people that are saying that this is terrible and a disgrace, end of story, they are correctfully, I think, pointing out the slippery slope that exists on the liberal democracy side, right? Like we obviously don't want the government to start deciding, who is supporting groups that go against the interest of America. Next thing you know, if you don't support Trump, you don't want to get a knock on the door, right? So we can obviously see how there's a slippery slope. I think it does complicate it a little bit, the fact that he's not a citizen, right? So there should be, this is a normative statement, not a descriptive, there should be different standards for people that are not American citizens in terms of what protections they have, especially when it becomes things that are against, national interests and national security than citizens. But that's a separate issue. But on the other side, I also think there's a slippery slope in the sense of, liberalism is only as strong as people are actually playing by the rules of liberalism. In other words, I think that there is a sort of meta question that I don't think liberals are focusing on enough, which is how accommodating does liberalism have to be to illiberal worldviews? And I think, what we've been seeing in a lot of liberal democracies, and this is of course true from the right, but I think it's equally true from the left. I mean, you look at a lot of places in Europe, and I think, I wouldn't want America to go this way. We just don't want to be in a society where supporting terrorism and supporting Hamas, forgetting the legalese, is just now a normative opinion that you encounter, within political discourse. And so from some perspective, I think that's a slippery slope also on the other side. And so I could see, the reason why I think a lot of Jewish groups are lauding this and a lot of activists are lauding this is because they're like, enough already. If no one's going to handle this, if, college professors, college administration, whatever, okay, we'll get Trump. This is, I think, why a lot of people broke for Trump, especially, Trump won over, an additional 15 to 20% of the Jewish vote than he did the other previous two times. And I think a lot of the incentive was just okay, if the liberals aren't going to do this, then Trump will. It's like David Frum's.
Yeah.
David Frum has a line. If liberals won't enforce borders, then fascists will. So it's almost the same thing, right? If liberals aren't going to deal with Hamas supporters on campus, then fascists will. And so I guess this is a little bit of me being torn.
Yeah, okay, it gave me a lot to unpack there. But first of all, I think that illiberalism imposed in defense of liberalism is not liberalism at all. I mean, to give an extreme example, if you started denaturalizing any American who was sympathetic to Hamas and then deporting them, I mean, I guess you have less Hamas sympathizers in the United States, but what have you accomplished by that? I mean, there's an old case from the 1990s called Texas versus Johnson. And Texas versus Johnson was about a Texas state statute that criminalized desecrating an American flag. And the point that the majority of the Supreme Court made was that if you're criminalizing the flag because it's a destruction of this symbol that protects liberty and speech, but in the process of doing so, you're limiting liberty and speech. What have you really accomplished? I mean, is the symbol itself more sacred than the rights that's protecting? So I just get very worried about this idea that we're going to start imposing a liberalism for the sake of defending liberalism. That makes me very, very uneasy. And then especially the way that this was done. I mean, something that I think is worth noting too is usually what happens when a green card holder, when they're trying to rescind their legal permanent resident status, they are given a notice to appear. They stay out of custody. They then go, they have their hearing, they have due process. They're informed of the charges against them. It is a methodical process. That is not what happened here. Even if somebody supports the ultimate goal here, which I do not, but even if someone did, it's very concerning how it's being done. Not only was he detained, not only do we have no information yet on what exactly the government is accusing him to rescind his green card status, but what's perhaps most troubling of all is they haven't been held at a detention center in Louisiana, a location that he has no connection to, that any incident he's accused of doing has no connection to. And my suspicion as to why they're doing it, again, other experts may be able to weigh on this and they may be right. I don't know. But my understanding is that immigration judges in Louisiana tend to be a lot more hostile to those who they may be trying to levy these kinds of accusations against than an immigration judge in New York. And so it seems like they're completely circumventing the normal rules, the normal process, and he's being detained, whereas normally somebody would not be detained during this process. So to me, it's just we're completely crushing liberalism. And for those who are saying that, you know, it's in defense of liberalism, I don't know what we've accomplished if we destroyed liberalism in the process.
I think if I was going to steel man this perspective that, I don't fully agree with, I think it's, the sort of devil and angel that pop up every time something like this happens. Listeners can argue which one is the devil and which one is the angel. Is that, maybe, liberalism itself, is the ideal. I'm still a liberal, right? A capital L, strong, liberal, but that essentially liberalism doesn't always work as liberalism, right? Like, again, I'm sort of, speaking a little bit off the cuff here. I usually like to have better thought out examples, but like, you know, a lot of times war can be, in the process of war, fundamentally illiberal things happen, right? But there are sometimes you need to go to war to protect liberalism, right? Like, it's just sort of, general ideas of, you know, we are at a crossroads right now, specifically on campus, but I think, within the wider, Western world writ large. And, there are plenty of countries that you can go to that will openly support, openly laud your support of these terrorist groups and everything like that. But we sort of have, norms in the West. And again, this is the slippery slope on both sides, because the West is also the only place that has, unadulterated freedom of speech. But if enough people who are illiberal come into a place like the US, socially that can change very quickly, even if the laws stay the same. Like, so I think on both sides you have to be worried, because essentially, if you're Jewish, let's just give an example right now. I don't think a place like London right now has the same amount of freedom of speech and expression as it did 20 years ago, right? Like if we were taking a trip to London together, and, no chance I would be, wearing a pin that says, an Israeli flag and free the hostages, right? It would just be stupid, right?
Yeah.
Not because it's illegal, although there have been some cases where there have been Jews wanting to counter protest anti-Israel rallies and the police actually saying, we can't protect you, you have to go home. So, okay, should London allow for rabid anti-Israel protests under the guise of free speech? So somebody who is, maybe a liberal absolutist, right? You're coming on this podcast and you're saying, well, yes, of course they should. But that also has downstream slippery slope effects of, well, it's essentially not safe for, Jews or anybody sympathetic to Israel. What happens in 30 years if certain areas of London become as, unempathetic to, gay people? So is waving a pride flag, right? You can almost see the slippery slope happening on the other side. And I don't think enough people give that slippery slope serious moral weight.
Well, so a few things to respond there. So first, I think that is a more of an argument for maybe why, there may be ideological considerations on who you're giving lawful status to begin with. But once you've given lawful status, it's a lot more, there's a lot higher standard on when you start taking it away, because there's certain rights that somebody has. I mean, you're a legal permanent resident at that point. You have many of the rights and responsibilities that a U.S. citizen does, minus a few, such as you can't vote. So I think what people need to really think about, and this is what happens anytime there is a debate about free speech, is you have to think, what will happen if the people who I don't want to have power, and then have these tools at their disposal, right? So imagine, a situation where somebody who considered the Israeli state to be a terrorist state, was president. I don't think we're anywhere near somebody who's that ideologically on the left being president. But imagine if the person had that power and had the ability to, we saw at UCLA, for example, that some of the protests got out of hand from the pro-Israel side as well, and some of the rhetoric was extreme. So if you had a situation where then the president of the United States could then order ICE to detain an Israeli student and subject them to deportation, that would be a really scary thought. So people have to, and it goes far beyond this issue of Israel-Palestine, as to a whole host of, it opens up a Pandora's box where the government could then, again, the president of the United States ordering ICE to apprehend somebody who is lawfully present, is a legal permanent resident, based purely off of an ideological position. That is a very, very scary thought. And so again, you have the ability to just completely dismantle and destroy liberalism.
For sure. I no, and I think this is why the sort of knee-jerk reaction, and even personally, is, this is bad. We want less of this. I do want to, I don't know if this is overly philosophizing too much, but I think, anytime you give government any power, you're opening this Pandora's box, right? Like even the US government, denoting certain groups as terrorist groups and other groups not, you're potentially opening up. I mean, right now, America, for a variety of reasons, obviously I agree with those reasons, has designated Hamas a terrorist group. They have not designated the Israeli state a terrorist group. So, if we have any weight on that, which, I think we should, right? If America designates a group a terrorist group or not, right, that should hold some moral weight.
Sure.
For sure, for general morals, but also as the application of US law. So then it would be a little bit harder. Then it's not just, oh, you supported, I don't know, this politician in France that I didn't like. Therefore, bam, it's not like you're, kicking out, foreign students left and right. This seems like a much more specific case of like, hey, we've decided that these are terrorist groups. These are not only against the interest of our ally Israel, they're not just against the interest of, the safety of Jewish students on the campus. They're also against, our national interest. We're essentially, giving you this golden ticket. There are tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in their 20s and 30s in the world that would do anything for an American green card and a chance to study at one of our universities. And instead of doing anything to, help pro-social behavior or, to study something that's going to either help you, help our country, help your home country, right? Further the goals of liberalism and globalism and all these things that I think we both want. You are specifically like making things worse on all cylinders. Like, I don't know. I don't, my knee-jerk reaction is not, this is where we need to draw the, like, I've seen some people on social media speak out stronger against this one case of deportation than I have, when Israeli hostages are being killed, right? Like, it's just like, every once in a while, there are cases like this that I feel like, to me, not even upset me necessarily, but confuse me, because when I hear a case like this, my mind immediately goes to arguing with itself. Like I was literally on a hike, with Rainier this afternoon, for 45 minutes. And I was walking there, like literally having this debate to myself. And then I called you right after on my drive home. But I was thinking about this and I was like going back and forth. And, I just don't think this is as simple. And again, not you in your posting, but I just have seen some people say like, this is the red line. And then you go back and see what they've said about, other issues in the last 3 months. And there's been just reticence on everything else. So like, I don't know. I guess like I'm not that quickly to, start to say, woe is us, there goes democracy. I don't know. I mean, tell me why that's wrong.
Well, let me give you a few thoughts. So first, I think that people who take my position on this need to be very careful not to make a hero out of this individual. Again, I tried to do a little research before I hopped on this with you, and again, it's not exactly clear to me to what. I mean, I saw some things that I really disagreed with. I don't know to what extent he was responsible for any type of building takeovers. That was very, very unclear to me. And quite frankly, I don't think that's been made clear by the federal government as well.
Let's just take a scenario. Let's just say, because it was unclear about the building takeovers also. Let's just say he walked around, and I don't even know if this is the case. Let's give a hypothetical scenario, right? You have somebody here on a green card and, every day they show up to campus with a t-shirt that says globalize the intifada, right? Maybe not even directly tied to any terrorist group, but something that I think is pretty clearly recognizable, at least to most sane people in the West, as like, this is in some way supporting terrorists. Now, again, protected under, First Amendment. for someone to be a full-blown American citizen, as much as it's abhorrent, right? I guess under the First Amendment, I think, we could have another interesting debate. Maybe we'll have it in a couple minutes. Are America's First Amendment laws even good? Should we go to something more like, places like Germany where it's illegal to support, Nazism or to deny the Holocaust, right? Like, I think that's another interesting philosophic conversation. I guess we'd both probably land on the First Amendment, pros First Amendment side. But the First Amendment is for U.S. citizens, right? Like it just seems like we're conflating this, right? Like I think one of the values of a constitution and a country that we have is that citizenship means something and non-citizenship also means something, and especially if you're on a green card. I mean, like I don't know, I'm imagining, right? Like there's a difference between what I'm going to tolerate in my kitchen if you are my child who I birthed versus if you're a guest that I'm inviting for lunch, right? Like there just is. And I think on the country level, it's sort of the same thing, right? If you're a citizen, that just should mean something different. Again, I'm throwing out a lot of the legal thoughts. I'm sort of thinking more philosophically. And again, I'm sort of spitballing here, but like that should mean something different to the point where like, okay, maybe it should run through the courts or whatever, but like if in a couple days or weeks or months, I don't know how long these things take, this Louisiana judge essentially says like, hey, sorry, you got to leave. And then everybody, left of center spends the next couple weeks, oh, how terrible is this, blah, blah, blah. Like, some part of me will be a little bit torn. I'm like, okay, well, did they consider this? Is this going to have downstream effects? But like, I'm still going to be torn about it. I'm still going to have the side of me that's like, all right, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe like we don't have to be so, hyper, you know, idealized in terms of, wow, we're liberals and free speech and all these things when like the other side, and yes, I am thinking of, terror supporters as like the other side in a binary, are just spending their days thinking like, how can I destroy Israel? Right? Like, you know what I mean? Like we're sort of squabbling with these high-minded ideals. And meanwhile, there are people here on student visas that are sitting around thinking like, how do we destroy Jewish institutions in the state of Israel? And like, so part of me is also like, okay, like screw them.
Sure. So a few things. First of all, I mean, it is true that not every right, responsibility, and privilege that a U.S. citizen has extends to non-citizens, but a lot of them do. For example, if you're charged with a crime, you still have strong due process protections. You are entitled to a taxpayer-funded, court-appointed attorney who is going to zealously defend your rights and zealously defend your interests, even though you may be unlawfully present in the United States, may have committed a horrible crime. You are nonetheless, under the Constitution, entitled to a American taxpayer-funded defense lawyer to basically try to keep you out of jail. And so, not every right and responsibility extends, but a lot of them do. And the First Amendment, I think, is one of those in most situations that does. Again, it's important to remember there's a difference between being a student visa holder and being a legal permanent resident. A legal permanent resident has essentially been granted permission to remain in the United States for the rest of their life, and there's only a few exceptions to that. A student visa, it's a lot more. There's a lot more discretion, and they might be on stronger legal footing, even though I would be concerned about this if they, did this to just as simply a student visa holder. But they're doing this to a legal permanent resident. So I just think it is worth noting that there still are strong legal and constitutional protections that apply to even people who are illegally present, but certainly somebody who is not just lawfully present but has legal permanent residency. So I just wanted to emphasize that distinction.
Yeah, let's take a little bit of a step back. I'm kind of curious to throw this out there. First Amendment and general support for terrorism. Let's just talk about now American citizens. So obviously, if I wear a T-shirt that says, I love Hamas, right? That's protected under the First Amendment, right? And probably should be normatively, right? I wear a shirt that says, I'm happy that Israeli babies were killed. That's also protected, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. That's also protected, right? Like, it does seem like at some point, and I think some of the protests on campus have come close, right? Saying there are organizations on campus that are supporting genocide, and it is our duty to stand up to them when everyone knows that organization is Hillel, right? Like, at what point, right? Because this seems like another massive gray area, right? And another case in which, again, I support the First Amendment, but I think liberalism could be, this double-edged sword that we keep, firing in deeper to ourselves. Like, at what point does that become like, okay, this is getting very close to like actually saying, hey, we should go do this violent thing? And again, there has been an uptick in anti-Semitism against Jews and Jewish institutions by the left, and right, also the right, but here we're specifically talking about the left-wing phenomenon. You know, at what point does that gray area come to a point where we actually want to roll that back and actually say, actually there are going to be limitations on the First Amendment, because this is actually a slippery slope that leads to violence, not, the left wing, words are violence, but like genuine violence. Like, I don't know. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts. So, again, where the line is crossed, I do think it is, actual incitement to violence. So, if you said, if somebody said, if you see a Jewish student on campus, you should attack them. If you see a Zionist student on campus, you should attack him. Rabbi Levine lives at this address. Go get him. That, clearly crosses the line. I think that one of the reasons too, where I get uncomfortable and wanting to give the government the power, even though I might, be with you ideologically on what they're saying is odious. I'm sure you, like I, have been accused of being a genocide supporter for expressing solidarity with Israel after October 7th. And so it just, I worry, especially if you create the standard of giving government this much power, and you see how some of these institutions are extremely left wing, how easily that can be turned on its head to go after people who are ideologically on your side. And again, I just think it's very easy to feel comfortable with this and to even cheer it on, or to even be torn about it when it's going after people that you really see as strong ideological opponents. The real test of liberalism is, are you willing to stand up for it when it protects your enemies? Are you willing to stand up for it when it's the flag burners, when it's when it's perpetrators of 9/11, right? To give a really extreme
I'll
example.
I'll tell you what bothers me, and I'm a little surprised, although not fully surprised, that it doesn't bother you as much as me, only because, I had the, I knew you all throughout your undergrad and law school, and now, your work, is that both me and you, I would say, have always been, very strongly principled, like classical liberals, in the sense of like,
Yeah.
let's have conversation, let's duke it out. Who cares if we offend each other, right? And I think both of us
Right.
have always, been that type where, I think people on the left think we're too right wing, people on the right think we're too left wing. I'm sure you still
Yep.
get that, right? I still get that all
Absolutely.
the time. What irks me, and again, maybe the answer is, and if you genuinely think this, let me know. The answer is, I just have to suck it up, and like, that's life. So that it could be the answer to my qualm. But like, when I was in college, and when you were in college, even the the left, writ large, right? I'm talking about, the mainstream left institutions, the universities, maybe the New York Times, NPR. They didn't really care about free speech, right? Like, this was during the age of, speaker cancellations on campus, and, people would freak out and the campus would do nothing. And you're like, the only people talking about principled defenses of the free speech were the right. And so, even though, I've never considered myself, a right winger, right? Like, if you wanted to hear somebody give a principled defense of free speech, it would be somebody like, Dennis Prager or Ben Shapiro or any of these people, right? All of a sudden, now that, many of the same things that the left has been doing to sort of, push down a lot of people that they didn't like in terms of speech, now that that's being done to this pro-Palestinian movement, who, you know, I'm not a right winger, but I think that the pro-Palestinian movement is much more odious than Ben Shapiro coming to campus. Now, all of a sudden, it seems like the same, left wing groups, like, all they care about is like liberalism and free speech and all these things. And like, in a sense, it's just not applied equally across the board. So like, free speech, even a little bit, has become this like tool that, okay, when it goes against them, they like don't care about it. And when it helps them, it's like the only thing that matters. Now, again, the answer might be, well, if you're really principled, you just need to suck it up on both sides and like just have everyone hate you, no matter who's in power. But like, that's just something that I think just constantly irks me, because I lived through this exact phenomenon on the other side. And I remember when I was in college and when I was in grad school, and somebody like a Ben Shapiro was coming to campus and, there were people physically restraining other people from walking in. And I would suggest to people who are a lot more left wing than I am, like, hey, it's free speech. Like, we don't have to like it, but like, everyone has a right to say whatever they want. This is a public campus. It would be met with like, no, this is not free speech. And how dare he? And this is hate speech. And these words are causing more violence against. And so all of a sudden to have these same people like unironically tweeting 10 years later or whatever, this is free speech violation. Like, I don't know. It irks me at a level that I'm surprised it's not irking you.
First of all, yeah, Daniel, I'm sorry to find out I'm sorry that you found out that hypocrisy exists in politics, but it is ubiquitous. Look, on the Dennis Prager thing, for example, like I would push back a little bit. I don't think that the right were these principled free speech defenders. I never felt that way. Some there are individuals on that exist. I would not consider Dennis Prager to be one of them. In fact, I specifically remember when he spoke at UC Irvine and I attended, he kept on talking about the right defends free speech, the left goes after it, and I pushed back a little bit on him. And I asked a question, and I gave him concrete examples of the right being more hostile to free speech on certain issues. I mean, flag burning, I think, is a really easy example of that. And he was willing to basically defend every restriction on speech. So, and then on the flip side, these same people are cheering on,
No, sorry,
aside...
I wasn't saying that, because I barely listened to Dennis Prager. I just remember that when he did come to UC Irvine, years ago, the people that were trying to get him kicked off were the same people that are now, right, the same type, right? Obviously, many of them have graduated. This was 7 years ago. But like, I'm not talking about somebody like Dennis Prager, who 10 years ago was a free speech advocate and now is cheering the people getting kicked off. I'm sure that he is also completely, inconsistent on this issue also, right? I have no desire to, defend him. I have no clue what he thinks about this. But the same, let's say zeitgeist that 10 years ago didn't care about free speech at all is now when it right, like again, the sort of other way to think about this is, right, to almost loop it in with sort of like this age old, paradox of anti-Semitism, right? Like if capitalism is bad, then the Jews are capitalists. If capitalism is good, then the Jews are communists, right? Like it's the same thing with like free speech. It's like, well, if it hurts, if it hurts Jews, then all we care about is free speech, and if it doesn't hurt Jews, then like whatever, free speech isn't that valuable. Like I don't actually think it's the same thing as strong as that, but it just seems like where were these principles coming out, and I still don't really see. I mean, again, there have been cases where, the same people, right? Let's just, we can zoom in on Colombia for a second, because that's obviously been ubiquitous in the news. The same people that are upset at the, violations of liberalism here, right, were saying nothing when classes were being disrupted by protesters, which is also, right, goes against liberalism. So it's a little bit of like that gripe. Again, it doesn't mean, right, I'll sort of argue with myself and then, you can decide which one of me to argue with, right? Like, again, it doesn't mean that, okay, we'll give up on all your principles and then try to like, accumulate as much power to screw the other side. That is a solution, by the way. Like, some part of me thinks that is, a lot of Theodor Herzl's solution of Zionism was essentially that of like, screw this whole game. Let's just make sure our army is stronger than the other army, because that's all that, so I think, that is one solution. I think, as Jews who have decided to stay in America, we're sort of, still at least in theory within this, framework of liberalism, which is worth defending. But I don't know. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, so it's in terms of the hypocrisy, it's funny. I think that the American story of liberalism is actually about oftentimes illiberal actors being the unwitting conduits of liberalism. And let me just give you a few examples of that. So, for example, the Westboro Baptist Church was sued for causing pain and emotional distress in a case called Snyder versus Phelps. And if anybody, I'm sure everybody here knows about the Westboro Baptist Church, but they have odious signs. They think that God is punishing America for homosexuality. They absolutely oppose liberalism, and I'm sure they think that, and have said that speech supportive of homosexuality should be criminalized. And yet at the same time, they were responsible for a landmark free speech case about that protected the Westboro Baptist Church's right to be able to picket outside of funerals. You have a whole series of cases coming out of terrorists, accused terrorists staying at Guantanamo Bay who petitioned for due process rights. These are people who do not care about due process. These are not people who care about liberty, but they ended up becoming accomplices to establishing incredible constitutional law. So does the hypocrisy among this, zeitgeist on the left bother me? Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I think that there's still, to me, it's not even that the sides have flipped. I think that there are some principled people on the left who have been consistent defenders of free speech. Somebody like Nadine Strossen, who used to be the president of ACLU, now is very involved in an organization called FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And there are some principled defenders of free speech on the right, like Eugene Volokh, who is a professor at UCLA Law. And everybody
Luke,
else.
I'm a pretty, I would say I'm like a level 2 political junkie. I'm not a level 7 like you. I've never heard of those two names, right? So, no, I'm sure they exist and I'm sure they're great people, but like these are not, the mainstream, if you're going to say a household name, I can't imagine any of our listeners, right? I just think it's ironic that like you're trying to search for two principled people and it's like,
Nadine
obvious.
Strawson is very well known. So there's at least, I mean, if people look her up, she's quite well known. As is Volokh. In the
No,
First
no,
Amendment world.
I'm sure they're very popular. I'm just saying I'm more remarking on. I think
Yeah.
it's funny that at least in your opinion, people are so inconsistent. It's not like you can point to like a congressman who's everyone's heard of, or
Sure.
a governor, or like a past president. You're like, oh, these two people who like, I'm sure are great people and doing interesting things, but like it's just funny that you had to go to
Yeah.
like maybe like C-list people as opposed to saying like, oh yeah, like I was talking to, I don't know, Barack Obama a couple years ago. Like, I don't know,
Well,
it is
I'm not
funny.
well connected enough. I've met and talked to Eugene Volokh. I've never met or talked to Barack Obama. But the point is, everybody else is, or a lot of other people are hypocrites. But nonetheless, though, again, I think that American liberalism is often advanced by people with liberal ideas, somewhat ironically. And even though it may irk me that those people are hypocrites, it doesn't irk me enough to not nonetheless support the claims that they're making.
So one of the things you get in a lot of like reactionary and also populist circles, and I think this is fueling a lot of the right and the left. So this is obviously a sentiment that a lot of young people have, and I actually hear this on campus a lot from both a lot of right wing and left wing students. Is some version of like, we've tried that and it doesn't work. And again, they have very different, reasons and proof points for why it doesn't work. And so now we need like, in case of emergency, break glass. I think, and again, I'm not defending this by any means. I'm just using this as an example of sort of, how the zeitgeist is changing. This is a left-wing example. The murder of the United Healthcare CEO, right? The fact that like essentially that was lauded on like leftist, social media posts and Reddit and Twitter. And like, I almost, it was crazy because I remember when the news broke and I watched the video and I was like, what the hell is this? And then for the next really like couple weeks, people were, cheering Luigi Malgione or however you pronounce his name. And like that essentially was some version, at least for me, of like, okay, we've tried the sort of liberal version of healthcare. It hasn't worked. It's led to a lot of people dying. We need this emergency. I think you have the same phenomenon on the right, the same types of people that, think that Trump is a panacea and that are happy because of all of these illiberal executive actions that the Trump is rolling in. They're essentially saying the same thing. And like, it does seem like the sort of middle of liberalism, which again, I still do consider myself in the middle, even though I am viewing, again, that slippery slope, again, trying to be on the, pinpoint of the mountain there is why I think I'm constantly wary of a lot of definitive arguments. Like, you do have I guess the sort of meta question is there ever, or at what point can things get so bad in a liberal society where you do need to say like, oh, okay, like we actually need this, top-down populistic solution? Because if we say never, and this is just a thought experiment, it could easily, we can turn around in a couple years and, we could have lost the entire society because, oh, we didn't speak strongly enough against, I don't know, the Hamas supporters or the Nazis, right? Like, in your example before, just, one more thought experiment, right? The other example you obviously were thinking about, you didn't give, is, the neo-Nazi Skokie landmark Supreme Court case where,
I,
Jewish lawyers defended the right for neo-Nazis. What was this, in the 60s or 70s?
in the
Um,
60s.
in the 60s, right, Skokie, Illinois, huge Jewish community, and neo-Nazis planned a massive march right through the Jewish neighborhood, and Jewish lawyers defended the rights of the Nazis to march. And in liberal circles, this is lauded as like, oh, isn't this incredible that this was done? And look how principled. But like, let's imagine an alternative universe where that march had happened and that inspired another march in another city and that inspired another march in another city. And it got to the point where 35% of the American public were suddenly marching neo-Nazis and they were burning synagogues. Historically, if I were to look back on that landmark Supreme Court case, I would have said, yeah, they messed up. The Supreme Court should have, said, no, the Nazis can't march. And like, okay, it would have been some tiny tick away from liberalism, but it would have essentially saved the society. Like, do you ever worry that we could get to that point where in a couple of years from now, if Hamas supporters are essentially comprised 20% of the American public, we could look back to a time like this and be like, yeah, we messed up by saying that this is, oh yeah, free speech and globalize the intifada. And like, now, buses are blowing up in New York City every day and, Jewish cafes are shot. And, just like I would never wear a kippah in Paris, it could easily get to the point where I'd be too afraid to wear a kippah in Los Angeles. So like, I don't know, does that worry you at all?
Yeah, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm not assessing the risk to the level that I should. I mean, I tend to be of the view that when you drive views underground, that they actually flow more freely. Maybe that's naive of me. To give a much more insignificant example, I do think that the way that college administrators have been at times quite hostile to conservative students is actually why you're seeing a lot of young people on college campuses tend to be shifting more to the right. And so I tend to be the view that you want these views out there, you want them debated, you want them discussed. Like, for example, right now, right, you used the example earlier about in Germany about how they ban, pro-Nazi speech. And meanwhile, though, you have these like very right-wing parties, these very far-right parties gaining in power and gaining in power. And I wonder, how much part of that, the responsibility of that is this sense of, well, these views can't be discussed, and then there's an underground discussion, and they're not talked about in the marketplace of ideas. So look, maybe I'll have egg on my face in 10 years. I don't think so. I think that you know the alternative is much worse, and that every place that's done it differently it's ended much more poorly. I mean, to me, it's like, why trade a system that has generally worked for one that has for others been so worked out so poorly? So again, maybe I'm being naive, but I'm not as worried, I guess, as you are that is going to be the result of it.
Yeah,
I mean, because ultimately, just to add on, I mean, it's like, why? I know there's multiple reasons why we're concerned about people who have ideological views that are sympathetic to Hamas, but at the end of the day, it's the illiberalism of it all, and the danger it poses to others, and discrimination, etc. And I'm just such a skeptic that the answer to that is imposing liberalism. Again, I mean, on the question, on the issues in London and stuff, I mean, there may be a conversation to be had on immigration and that sort of thing, but I don't think the answer is to ban mosques in Europe, as some people on the right in Europe have proposed.
Yeah, I guess I'm starting to see a tension. I don't yet really feel this, but I'm starting to see a tension between protecting Jews and defending general liberalism, because general liberalism has at times failed to protect Jews in very serious ways. And so in my head, right, again, it was, and it still is from some perspective, illiberal to have a state that tries to keep itself majority ethnically Jewish, right? Like
Yeah.
obviously Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, but it's a different type of democracy than America, right? Like I think that's sort of obvious, right? Like so there is a sense of illiberalism there that Israel does try to very carefully, is constantly trying to figure out, okay, what's the population? Obviously, we have this percent, non-Jews and this percent Arab and whatever. So, okay, if we're having people that are coming in, for immigration, they're not going to grant, hundreds of thousands of people who aren't Jewish, citizenship because they're afraid of that majority. And my answer to that is not, well, I'm a principled liberal across the board, so every country needs to adopt, American liberal attitude. It's, hey, Jews have gotten really screwed over in the past and there's been anti-Semitism. So like, yeah, Israel should be an exception to some general liberal principles. Now, it doesn't mean that Israel should start, throwing Christians in jail. Like, I'm sure 0.1% of the far right in Israel like would clap on that because they'd be like, oh yeah, of course, a Jewish state. So, I don't mean going that far, but like there are times, especially on these edge cases, and I do think what we're discussing now is sort of one of those edge cases that I'm like, okay, well, there is a little bit of a tension there. Like, I quite frankly would feel safer at night if I was a Columbia student tonight than I did last night, right? Like, I just would, because not only is it this one person that, I don't remember his name, people can obviously look it up, that's sitting in a Louisiana prison. I'd imagine there's a lot of fear now going on in other, students that are de facto supporting Hamas. And like, so again, the, intellectuals can, sit around debating, values and liberalism and blah, blah, blah. If I'm an 18-year-old that's terrified, listen, my friend's little brother was supposed to have his senior year at Columbia this year, and he decided to take community college classes over the summer last year, so he didn't have to return to Columbia for his senior year. And like, this is somebody that was, loving his college experience, his freshman and sophomore year, right? It's what everyone dreams of. You're going to New York City, you're going to have a college experience, and he was literally too afraid to go back, because he, had he had lived in Israel before, and he was just like, it was an awful experience. He just like walked around, either too afraid to show your identity, or if you were showing your identity, you were just terrified you were going to get screamed at or even assaulted. And so, like, if I'm that guy or whatever this year's version of that guy is, like, I am sleeping better at night. And like, and that is thanks to this executive action of this administration. And, I think, we can also, the other thing that I kind of wanted to get your mind on, because, you've been, you are extremely critical of Trump, in a way that I think is also very principled. But Trump is doing things, the $400 million of grants to Colombia, like taking that away, like, again, I think that also is generally good. Like, yeah, like scare these schools a little bit, you know. So I don't know. I guess that's more how I'm thinking about liberalism and the protection of Jews and, where Israel fits into all this than, sitting there being like, because the other sort of point that I want to get at here, um, is that a lot of times I feel like, Jews, whether it be, religious ideals or moral ideas, or in America, liberal democracy centric ideas, Jews have always wanted to be like hyper principled. And a lot of times that's, turns out the way the world works oftentimes isn't with a bunch of people sitting around being hyper principled. It's people sitting around, especially when it comes to Jews, thinking like, how can we, screw these people over? And so like, there is some sense of like, and I think this is very much like a Israeli versus an American debate, because, Israelis are just like, I mean, loving Trump and everything like that. And it's American Jews that are like, well, this is, illiberal and all these things. But like, I think also, I think every individual in the Jewish community should also be feeling that tension. And I'm certainly feeling that tension. I mean, we've had probably 30 phone calls in the last year directly about this, but I don't know if we've ever
Yeah.
discussed, you haven't
Well,
been on the
yeah,
podcast,
and
so
Dan, you have this incredible ability of making your guests' mind race as fast as yours, because you put out a lot of thoughts there, and you gave me a lot to think about. The grant issue, I don't have enough of a developed view, but I think I'm much more sympathetic to something like that, of saying to a university, look, you let things get way out of hand, way past anything that's protected by the First Amendment. Certainly, if a group of pro-MAGA people had started an encampment and refused to leave, clamp down a lot quicker. And your failure to protect Jewish students means consequences for your university. I think that's on much stronger footing, than going after an individual student for that individual student's ideological views. In terms of the safety issue, I'm going to give an answer that's going to probably be very unsatisfying to both you and your guests, but very much comes from my perspective as a public defender. I think that in liberal society, we do sacrifice some level of safety and security for freedom. I mean, I go in every day and I defend people who are sometimes accused of really, really, really bad shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on your podcast, but
you are. Don't
some
worry.
really bad. I don't know if this is going on
Well, I
broadcast.
always say, Joe Walsh, who I know, the former
Yeah,
congressman,
yeah,
and very anti-Trump former Republican congressman, who I know agree with a lot, at least in terms of his anti-Trump bona fides. He was constantly dropping f-bombs, and
yeah.
I was like, I guess if a former Congress member is able to say it, it can be said on the podcast. So
Well, my parents are very mild mannered, so if they watch this and hear this, I do apologize. But anyways, though, so and I've gotten I've won people's cases. I've gotten cases dismissed. Uh, where just objectively, the streets of Los Angeles are probably a little bit less safe as a result. But
So I'm going to tailor it. So no, so I think that's really interesting, and I agree, and I am glad that you exist. But let's give another thought experiment. Let's say you specialized in this section, I already forgot the number, I think 1227 or whatever,
yeah,
or whatever. Your specialization was you were the top public defender of people who support terrorist groups that want to destroy Israel.
yeah,
Right. So that is just your thing, right? Like any case in the United States where, somebody that supports the Houthis or Hezbollah or
yeah.
Islamic Jihad or anything like that, you defend them. Listen, I do think that there would be a reasonable argument to say, if I could elect, a governor or a president that would just arbitrarily throw you in jail for the rest of your life, again, would be terrible, the most illiberal thing possible. But like utilitarian wise, like especially if anti-Semitism's on an uptick and I'm just watching, left and right, you winning all these cases, letting these people walk free, like I would be torn. Like I genuinely would. And I would hear all the principled arguments against it. And then on the other side, right, I would say, okay, but Jewish state, like Jews, if Jewish history has taught us anything, Jews can't be overly principled at the risk of their own safety. Like you read essays of, I'm teaching a class right now on American Jewish history, and we're right after World War One, right? This is when things get juicy, right? And like you read accounts of Jews in Germany after World War One, like 1920s, 1925, right? Like, and people are talking about Germany as if it's like, you know, the progressive era is here and the end of history has come and this is the messianic era, and like these are smart Jews, these aren't Jews on Twitter in the 1920s, right? Like smart principled people were saying like we don't need a messianic age because Germany's our messianic age, right? Like
Yeah.
you know and you say, okay, well, this was people that were so deluded by whether it's principles or political ideology. Like I don't know, like I'm curious. So like you as a public defender, like yes, it is generally good that like we would want more, what's it called, false, we would want more false acquittals than we would false, people getting put in jail, right? Like I would much rather live in a world where my chance of getting, my car broken into goes up by 1% for my chance of getting, wrongfully detained and the police opening up in the middle of the night to go down 1%. Sure, I'm taking that bet every time. But like once it starts getting like a little bit more personal, right? Like if you were the best defender of child, rapists, I'm sure there is. I'm sure, you tell me, I'm sure that within California right now, there exists somebody who is known as you are the best at defending people against cases of child rape, and there is a question, again, I'm not saying that, it's great that we have a system that allows for everybody to have the right to a defense. And that's sort of like on the abstract, lofty perspective. And like, there is another perspective of like, yeah, if this guy's winning cases and, someone offers me in the abstract, like, hey, the governor says they're just gonna like, wrongfully accuse this guy of something and put him in jail for the rest of his life. Like, am I saying like, no, we have to be principled? Or am I saying like, no, this guy's led to, a bunch of, 12-year-old girls' lives being ruined? Like, I don't know. I think that has to eat at you a little bit. Not you as a public defender, but like, I do think as you create this case study and blow it up a little bit, like this has to be a moral question.
But yeah, by the way, I just want to finish something I was going to say earlier, just because I know people in my office are probably going to listen to this and watch this. When I made the comment about getting people off who maybe make the streets more dangerous, and I was proud of those wins too. And I think it's a feeling, and that truly nobody else who doesn't do this job can ever understand or ever comprehend. I think part of it though is
No,
when you,
listen, I totally get it. Sorry, I'm going to cut you off only because, like, obviously Shane, my wife, is a doctor, and we talk all the time about similar questions of again, for me, okay, obviously the surgery done on Sinwar, I think, is the chief example, but
yeah,
the
yeah, it's a good
Pittsburgh
example.
synagogue shooter in 2018,
Right.
right, when he was rushed to the hospital, one of the people on his surgical team was a Jewish surgeon, and this guy gets on an interview on CNN, and they're like, how can you save this guy? And he's like, listen, I'm a surgeon. When a patient comes in, I don't care about anything like that. And I think for me, there's still a question, right? Like, maybe not that guy because he was already like in custody and whatever, but like if you're, again, I think retrospectively, like, is it good that Israeli doctors saved Sinwar's life by removing this brain tumor? Like, they used Israeli taxpayer money to perform a life-saving surgery on someone that, like, if they just did nothing, nobody would have ever known. And, okay, so the three people who would have found out, they would have, their principals would have taken some hit, but like 1,000 Israelis would still be alive, whatever. Like, am I saying that and like, oh, what a great case of principle? Or am I saying like, okay, this is a case, in the Talmud, there's a category called a chassid shota, right? A chassid is somebody who's very pious, and shota is a fool, and it's somebody whose religious principles are at such a high level that they're just doing stupid things. So the Talmud gives a number of examples. One of my favorite examples is obviously there's a Jewish if you're an Orthodox Jew or a very traditional Jew, you don't look at you don't want to stare at a woman, and especially not a woman who's swimming. So one of the cases the Talmud gives is somebody who is walking by a lake or a river and hears cries saying I'm drowning, but he realizes it's a female voice and doesn't look because he doesn't want to see a woman improperly dressed and she drowns, right? Like, so I'm thinking about that case and like I do think that has to come at play. Now, again, I don't think every lawyer and every surgeon should, that's a slippery slope on the other side. Like, I don't think you should always be running this calculation. But like me, as somebody who's trying to understand this from outside the system, that's like hasn't dedicated my life to like healing whoever walks into my office or hasn't dedicated my life to defending whatever, criminal walks in. I think like from a bird's eye view, there is a question of, at some point, okay, where do principles hit the road? And like, okay, well, there's also real life to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's an interesting point. I mean, I was one way that I was thinking about it is I think that our work, and we've really kind of strayed away from the topic, but it's an interesting question. I think that our work, makes the government better. It makes them more accountable to the people. It ensures that, citizens' rights are respected, and that, if you start slacking on for any one person, it all goes out the window. But it's an interesting question. I think that at doing my job, I don't you're somebody who you're paid every day to wrestle these types of questions. I'm paid every day to not wrestle with them, to sort of do it. I say dogmatically, not in a bad way, but to just think, look at every person defend is deserving of representation. And I think that maybe explains why I'm sort of, so attached to liberalism above some of these other concerns, is because that's sort of how I approach my job every day. It's liberalism trumping over these other issues. Now, other people get paid to consider, maybe the interest of a victim or interest of society, but that's not where I come in. And so I think that maybe colors my view on the issue that we initially got here to discuss.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty. Yeah, I think that's an interesting. There are a lot of other downstream places I want to go, but I'll spare you because I know we've been talking for a while. Is there anything else that you think we missed, either on this specific case or in this philosophic tangent that we wandered on the last 30 minutes?
Daniel, I think we gave the viewers a lot of interesting stuff to listen to and to discuss. So I think that's all I have to say for now.
Amazing. We'll have to do this again sometime. Thank you again.
Absolutely. All right.